Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition here of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host, Christopher Shepard. Happy Friday to you all. I hope all is well. It has been quite some time since I have seen you last. Not since Monday have we had a show during our weird holiday schedule here, but before we get into the true spirit of the holiday season, I come to you with more fantasy advice and perhaps the final fantasy football advice you will be receiving from me this year. We start off, as always, with my favorite Friday segment: start, sit, for your second round playoff matchups or potentially for your championship matchups if they are a week sooner, but most importantly, our final ones of the year probably. Then I'm going to update you on something we'll be talking about a little bit more often here: the college football playoff, specific odds for the top 5 favorites as we head into tonight's first round action. And then can conclude with our Sunday night football preview. First, talking about it from a betting perspective, it's going to be an interesting game, Bucks, Cowboys. Then, from a fantasy perspective, who to start and who to sit, as always, to conclude the week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Well, the week of 2 shows, and then we can get into the true holiday spirit and wish us all a very Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. But before we get into any of the fun stuff we do here on the show, I do want to remind you to consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show on the network if you haven't done so already and you want to view more content such as this. But if you want to contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, as always, like I said, to contribute and interact with the show throughout its duration. You can do it with our website as well at gsmcspodcast.net. It just makes the show that much better, and I love hearing all your opinions throughout the show. But without further ado, let's jump into our first segment of the day, talking about some starts for your second or championship round fantasy football matchups. And as always, I try to be as impartial as possible when making this list, but I know what's at stake here, and I decided to go with a lot of players who have very favorable matchups, but also can be reliable in these kinds of situations. They have the easy matchups, yes, but it's not just about the easy matchups. It's about the talent of the player and how you utilize them week in, week out. And these 6 players at each position, unfortunately, we didn't get to all of my positional rankings to kind of show you my thought process there, but here we stand with my favorite starts of week 16, second round fantasy playoffs upcoming. Let's jump right into them, starting off with a QB. A guy who was pretty obvious is going to be starting the rest of the way for a lot of people who own him, Josh Allen. Going up against the Patriots and closing out with 2 games against them and a game against the Jets, it's very clear and apparent that Josh Allen is going to be very popular and hot commodity among fantasy football circles. He's someone who I feel like is destined right now to win the MVP award, and he's just going to continue to do it against this weaker AFC East opposition, going against a Patriots team that, yes, has proved that it still has fight within it, but not necessarily within its own division, and Josh Allen looks like he's going to steamroll the competition these next couple of weeks on his way to his first MVP award, potentially a very important number 1 seed in the AFC playoffs. Nobody, I feel like, will want to go into Buffalo, especially with those wintry conditions like we saw last year. The way this well-oiled Buffalo Bills machine is playing. Yes, Josh Allen's very likely going to have to carry this team all the way because that defense concerns me. But he's highly capable of doing it, and he's proven it these past 2 weeks with 2 of his best performances of the season. One of the first quarterbacks to have multiple passing touchdowns and multiple rushing touchdowns in back-to-back games in quite some time. So he's performing at quite a high level right now that you feel can carry you to fantasy glory. And so that's why I feel like for these next couple of weeks, Josh Allen's going to be very popular and a very hot commodity amongst those who own him and are happy to own him at this point. Then the running back position here, I went a little bit off kilter with this decision. Definitely not someone who's been as highly gifted as we thought this season in terms of how many touches, how many targets you would see in this new look offense, even though new head coach of the Atlanta Falcons, Raheem Morris, promised he would get this guy a lot more touches. But Bijan Robinson has an opportunity against a Giants defense that's kind of packing it in a little bit this season, despite the fact that perhaps their best aspect of their team is their run defense. He has a unique opportunity here. Michael Penix being installed as the starter, and this looks like the perfect game to get him going. But he is going to have to rely on his backfield a lot here, just because I feel like even if we know that Michael Penix Jr. has all the arm strength in the world, this is not like the receiving core he had in Washington, where we know what those receivers were capable of there. He's definitely going to have to be a lot more patient, and thus the screen action, kind of play action designs are going to have to be very effective for him in this one. And that stems from what Bijan Robinson could be able to do here. And if Michael Penix Jr. settles into this game, develops a rhythm, look for him to entrust Bijan Robinson a little bit more. And I feel like if Bijan Robinson really helps Michael Penix Jr. get in rhythm, he's going to be a huge X factor in a fantasy standpoint because of what this offense could look like, because of what might be Michael Penix Jr.'s limitations and what he might need Bijan Robinson to need to help him to do. And so that's why I'm really high on Bijan Robinson, despite the fact he's had kind of a down year. Let's see if this insertion of Michael Penix Jr. into the QB spot helps elevate Bijan Robinson's game to really help this rookie quarterback down the stretch. And in the fight for a potential playoff spot, as they're still in the NFC South race. They hold the tiebreaker over the Bucs. They're undefeated against them. And if the Bucs slip up, which they might and we'll get into later in this show, then look for Atlanta to potentially pounce on that opportunity. But then at the wide receiver position, this guy has been a fantasy darling for these past 2 seasons. And down the stretch is really going to be someone who's going to be closely monitored, maybe not just for this season, but for the long-term future of his status as a fantasy asset, Puka Nacua. And I feel like down the stretch for the Rams, they're definitely going to play like one of the most comfortable teams in the NFL. This is a dangerous Rams team right now, should they get into the postseason. Yes, they still have to defeat Seattle in that final game of the season, which could be for the NFC West, but I do feel like in all this buzz surrounding this team, Puka Nacua remains the epicenter of what they want to do. He's the guy who, no matter where he is on the field, Matthew Stafford, I do believe, relies upon the most. And it's funny, considering that this team also has Cooper Kupp, who's one of the most elite pass catchers in the league and one of the most elite route runners as well. But Puka has proven he's the perfect complement. He wins 50-50 balls. He loves living in the short to intermediate areas of the field, loves the out routes, also can extend downfield should he need to, and most importantly, puts up points on the board for you. And so, in these games, this first game of 3 down the stretch for the Rams, starting off with the Jets, and what everyone could be seeing as a potential trap game here for how well the Jets played against the Jags, albeit being the Jags, I do feel like Puka Nacua is going to get a large number of targets here and receptions for you. And I do feel like he's going to merit consideration to start in these high-stakes playoff matchups for you. I just feel like now is the time for this Rams offense to really show what they are, prove that they could be a dark horse should they get to the postseason, and Puka Nacua is going to be the reason why a lot of people like them. So look for Puka to make some noise. Speaking of NFC West players, this one who has kind of lost his luster but still very highly viable in these high-stakes matchups at the tight end position. How about Trey McBride? Someone who's kind of fallen to the wayside a little bit these past couple of weeks. That Seattle game definitely did a number on him for how well they covered him. But in this game against the Panthers, which I expect to be much closer than a lot of people would expect, I do feel like Trey McBride's going to be a huge asset in this matchup. These are two very physical teams, two teams that want to play the ball control game, but most importantly, what separates the Cardinals from the Panthers right now is the fact that they have more physical targets like a Trey McBride. So look for Kyler Murray to try and develop that rapport yet again, because the Cardinals, remember, are not mathematically out of it just yet. They could even surpass Seattle here. And so look for Arizona to come out firing on all cylinders, excited about what they saw from the Cowboys against the Panthers after the Panthers seemingly were one of the toughest teams to beat in the league, and really try and get back to what they know best. Ground and pound football with a side of Trey McBride, trying to just impose your will against them, batter the opponent into oblivion, and it's going to be the best Arizona Cardinals football we've seen in quite some time. So that's what I think will happen in this one. So look for Trey McBride to get back to what he was to start the season. And then last but not least, kind of a risky one, more of a long shot than a lot of the one that is picked. We're going to talk about this defense a little bit more in the show. The Cowboys. And I feel like from last week to now, this definitely looks like a much worse pick because of what the Bucs offense did to one of the league's better defenses in the Chargers last week. But I do feel like this Cowboys defense has gone under the radar for this late season rejuvenation. Yes, we forget about, Micah Parsons' importance because of the fact he was injured, and they looked so lackluster without him, even though they still had a lot of talented players. But since his return, this defense has not allowed as much third down conversions, not allowed as much big plays, and really gotten back to what they've done really well year after year with Micah Parsons in the middle of that defense. And that's shutting down opponents. And yes, the Bucs are going to be a tough nut to crack because they're playing one of the most dangerous teams in the NFL. But I do believe that the Cowboys defense is going under the radar. And I still think a lot of people love this defense in a fantasy setting, and they might want to rely upon it in a high-stakes matchup. So look for a lot of owners to really utilize this Cowboys defense, and potentially yourself as well. But let me know what you think about this list in the comments. A potential final start list of the fantasy football season. But coming next, we have to talk about the guys you might want to avoid. My top sits of the second round in the fantasy playoffs right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. Some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Now before we get into our second segment, I do want to remind you yet again that if you feel so inclined throughout the show's duration to contribute and interact a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube or our website, gsmcpodcast.net. You can either leave a tip or donation by clicking the Super Chat button here on YouTube, or just leave a question, comment, or concern if you so choose throughout the show's duration. Let me know that you appreciate the show, and I will read your opinion out loud. Let me know that I appreciate you and what you do for this show. It is greatly appreciated in advance, and just makes the show that much better. Without further ado, let's get into our second segment of the day, talking about the top sits of this second round of the fantasy playoffs. Now, a lot of people might be a little bit skeptical of some of these choices because they've truly performed above their expectations, some of these guys, or right where they were projected for most of the season. And I just feel like in certain moments, in high-stakes situations, certain people need guidance in terms of last-minute decisions. Maybe one area of their team is more loaded and stacked than others, while others need a little bit of work and analysis. So that's what I wanted to do here with this one. And so while a lot of people might be apprehensive to take heed to this list, it is one that I feel a lot of people might want to look at and analyze a little bit more closely based off matchups or based off how certain players have been performing, whether you've noticed an uptick in performance or a downward trend. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with perhaps my most controversial pick in this sits list at the QB position, because this guy has been rock solid at the QB position in fantasy, but he's never really been and gotten his flowers one of the best at fantasy. And so I feel like this guy in this moment might not be the most appealing option. This is outside of matchups, but also when I think about this matchup, it does strike me as a weird one, right? Because this Detroit Lions team has so many injuries that I'm not necessarily certain that this offense can consistently keep up with this depleted defense, should this defense start to show a little bit more cracks like they did against Buffalo this past week. And going up against a Chicago team that, yes, seems to just want this season to end. Look out for Jared Goff to potentially slip up here. And I'm not saying to the degree that he's not, a highly regarded performer in this game. I still think production is going to play a key role in how people think about him. But I just feel like in this setting, his appeal might lose a little bit of luster, but also in this divisional matchup where the Lions are coming in so battered and beat up, I just feel like the Chicago team might want to play for a little bit more pride than you think. And so that's why I feel like Jared Goff might not have performance typical of what we've seen of him. As Tyler Sperry enters the chat, Patrick Taylor or Kendre Miller. I only know one of these players, unfortunately, my man Tyler, but welcome to the chat. I'm not sure who Patrick Taylor is. Maybe you were confusing two players. As I look up, he is the backup running back. Yes, I imagine that he would be a San Francisco 49er due to their lack of depth at the running back position because of the loss of not just Mason but Garendo. And then Kendre Miller of the New Orleans Saints. I do feel like, it's going to come down to the depth of your running back room and how you feel about these different running back situations. Because remember, Kendre Miller is mainly a bit part player in this offense because of what Alvin Kamara does, but he still gets a lot of red zone touches, whereas Patrick Taylor is more of an unknown commodity. But because of the lack of depth behind him now in this 49ers running back room due to all these injuries, he's going to get the bulk of the carries. So I do feel like, as he does say, that Patrick Taylor is the starter. So thank you for reminding me. So I do feel like if you feel your running back room is deep enough to complement a guy like Kendre Miller, then pick Kendre Miller. But I do feel like if your running back room is your weak spot, then a guy like Patrick Taylor might be worth taking a risk on. So I don't know how that helps you out, but hopefully you make the decision in which you feel best complements your running back room. That being said, if I were someone who is just looking at this from a pure perspective, I do feel like Patrick Taylor is going to get a better opportunity than Kendre Miller, but Kendre Miller is going to get more valuable touches. So it really depends on the depth of your running back room. But thank you for your comments, as he also mentioned that Kamara is doubtful. That does put it in perspective, but I don't necessarily think Kendre Miller is one of those running backs who can carry the load like a Kamara can. I think he's going to be more of a ground and pound guy, whereas Patrick Taylor could be someone, because of this opportunity, that could see a lot more valuable touches and be a lot more involved with the 49ers do as they play out this season. So I do feel like Patrick Taylor might be the go-ahead, but depending on how you view your running back room, Kendre Miller could be someone you want to look into. But if you just had to choose without any knowledge, or if I just had to choose without any knowledge of who your other running backs were, then I would say Patrick Taylor will be the guy. And I hope that really helps you. Thank you for your comments here as well. But getting actually into the running back position for my top sits of the week is someone who I think might fall to the wayside should my top tight end perform to his standard again, and it's James Conner. And I do feel like James Conner has slowly been falling down the pecking order these past couple of weeks after a lot of people, especially you in my comments, were really coming to me talking about how James Conner could impact your fantasy team. And I feel like this Panthers defense, yes, isn't necessarily known for their run defense, but it's sneakily getting better. And I do feel like they're going to want to key in on stopping the run, which will allow, like I said, Trey McBride to get going, but really hinder the best of what James Conner can do in this offense. So that's why I feel James Conner is not going to be as hot a commodity as he once was for this Cardinals team. And it might just be for this 1 week, because I do truly believe that down the stretch, James Conner's value could increase, and potentially he could be a look at for your championship matchups. So I do feel like there are certain aspects of James Conner that might not truly eliminate him from contention for these high-stakes games, but for this matchup here, if I truly believe that the Cardinals are going to get back to trying to get the best out of their receiving options, especially a guy like Trey McBride in this one, then I do feel that James Conner is not going to be in the spotlight for most of this one. So I do believe he's going to have to take a seat. In terms of wide receivers, this is someone who is kind of not, I don't want to call it zero to hero, just because I still love this guy and what he's done this fantasy season. But in this matchup, it's going to be really, really tough one for him for what the Eagles are going to throw at him. So Terry McLaurin, I don't necessarily like this week. And for any potential fantasy owners who might be making last-minute decisions about him, because I do think that Jaden Daniels is going to rely a lot upon him in this matchup, but I don't necessarily feel like this Commanders offense needs to be predicated on the explosive play to win. And so that's why I feel like, even though I think the Commanders have a better shot of winning than they did a couple weeks ago against Philly, I do think that it's going to have to come down to Jaden Daniels' decision-making in short to intermediate areas of the field, and also that run game, which we know can be potent at any given time. I really love that rushing attack for the Commanders. And if Terry McLaurin doesn't get going, then I do feel like there's a lot of value potentially in that group for these pivotal playoff matchups. So look for Terry McLaurin to potentially, just for this week, kind of lose his luster a little bit because of what the Eagles can throw at him in terms of multiplicity and coverages and who he's lining up against time after time and rep after rep. So that's why I feel like Terry McLaurin is not necessarily going to be a popular commodity, at least for this matchup. But down the stretch, I still think he has a lot of value as a pivotal fantasy receiver, especially considering championship level matchup, because that's where the stakes get high and you don't necessarily want to mess that up. Then the tight end position, this is an unusual one as well. I do still think this guy in a championship setting could be a tight end one or potential flex option, but I just look at this matchup and think that I feel Sam Darnold's going to rely a lot more on both Jefferson and Addison than TJ Hawkinson against the Seattle defense, because look at the Seattle defense. I do believe their strength is in their linebackers. As a Seattle fan myself, I do believe that ever since the Arizona game, these linebackers have been better in coverage. Ever since they brought in Ernest Jones IV as kind of the leader of that group, they really have keyed in on tight ends and really limiting what tight ends can do. I don't necessarily know off the top of my head any stats that corroborate my story, but I do feel like what I've seen out of the Seattle defense ever since the bye to now, going into this very pivotal matchup for them, mind you, is the fact that they really key in on narrowing the middle of the field and making it tough for guys like TJ Hawkinson to get going. And this is not an indictment of him because he is a very unique tight end in that he really likes to extend routes, really likes to get to the outside, really likes to work on the perimeters and outside the numbers. But I do feel like the Seattle linebackers have really been the bright spot in this defensive turnaround for them. And I do think they'll do a good job of limiting him. Not to mention that Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison are still going to get their production as well in this matchup. So look for that to really impact what TJ Hawkinson does, potentially in a negative manner. And last but not least, the defense and special teams unit that is pretty obvious that might have to take a seat is the Browns. Talk about a defense that has really gone from hero to zero from last year to this year. And going up against the Bengals offense that is one of the most high-powered in the NFL, and their defense is starting to complement them very well. This could be a rough day for a Browns team that actually had so much hope since the insertion of Jameis Winston to now, where they're convinced they have to start DTR to get any offensive production. I feel like this Browns team is just slowly losing its fantasy luster. Potentially next year, things could change. Potentially if they draft a guy like Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward or take a flyer in a later round on someone. But for now, this is where the Browns are. And it's not a place we thought they would be at the start of the year. But let me know what you think about my sits, because all of them could be controversial to some, could make sense to many. But ultimately, it's what I thought of for these high-stakes playoff matchups and the decisions you have to make. But coming up next, we pivot a little bit to the college football world. First round action of the CFP takes place tonight, but before we get into that, I want to update you on the top 5 betting favorites to win it all. So, right after the break, we'll talk about that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of the day, we are looking at the college football playoffs, talking a little bit more about college football. Now the fantasy football season in the NFL is winding down, and now we transition into at least first round action of the CFP tonight, and then more fun action on the stretch as more important games are played in the CFP picture. The first ever 12-team CFP, might I add. So very exciting stuff down the stretch here in these winter months. But before we get into any of that action, I did want to update you on the top 5 betting favorites here to win it all. These are the teams that Vegas really thinks have the best chance to really make an impact in the first ever 12-team CFP by being its first ever winner. And all 5 of these teams are great teams, but they have their flaws. This is a wide open race here, so you can interpret this however you want. If you're an aggressive bettor, you might like some outsiders that might not be on this list, but if you want to go by the book, then potentially this could really help you narrow it down. Without further ado, let's jump right into the top 5 betting favorites to win it all in the CFP. Starting off with number 5, this is a talented team. This is a team that got the easier side of the bracket, really is rounding into form, and could have been, if a couple plays had gone their way, Big Ten champions, potentially the number 1 seed. They have the offense, they have the defensive pieces and weapons to really get at you, but they do have some flaws that might keep them a little bit down this list, and the reason why they're number 5 here, the Penn State Nittany Lions, at plus 550. Now, I love what they've done with this offense, bringing in offensive coordinator Andy Kotelnicki from Kansas, revitalizing what Drew Aller can do downfield, getting the most out of a guy like Tyler Warren, their do-it-all tight end who can line up anywhere on the field and hurt you. And what they've gotten out of their defense is a front that includes a guy like Abdul Carter, who's going to be a really high draft pick in the 25 NFL draft, that really can generate a lot of pressure. But I do feel like the one issue I have with Penn State is an over-reliance on Tyler Warren in certain situations. And Drew Aller, yes, he's a fantastic quarterback who really has elevated his game from year one to now. But I do feel like if teams start to key in on Tyler Warren, these elite defenses that they're going to have to face down the stretch here, even on the easier side of the bracket, I do feel like Penn State's going to have to diversify that offense a little bit more. Going to have to get a guy like potentially Harrison Wallace, their second leading receiver, going. Young stud and Amari Evans having going. And then also rely on your backfield, one of the strongest backfields in this 12-team CFP, and Nicholas Singleton and Kaytron Allen to really make up the balance here. Because I think the defense, despite the fact that they gave up 45 to Oregon, is the best aspect of this team. I really like how this front seven and the secondary cohere. I really like how this front seven generates pressure and how the secondary cleans up. I love Jalen Reed at the safety position. This pick six against Wisconsin was a pivotal point in Penn State's season. And I do think that at the end of the day, they have enough potency on that side of the football to pull out football games. But this offense is going to have to become a little bit more multifaceted to believe in them. So this is why I feel like they're the fifth betting favorite rather than a little bit higher on this list. But I do think that on that side of the bracket, should matchups go their way, and this one against SMU they don't want to overlook, even though it's at Beaver Stadium in that whiteout crowd. If matchups break their way, and you get, say, an Indiana upset, and say a Georgia team that might be playing without Carson Beck, in fact I do believe it's confirmed that he will miss the CFP, then Penn State can make a run at this thing. But they're going to have to find different options on offense, especially in the passing game, to really get that ball rolling. That's why they sit at number 5. Then at number 4, perhaps the most talented team in the field, a real dark horse for a lot of people to win it all, but a team that has faced its number of miscues, stunning upsets, and ultimately not necessarily cohesion that you would like out of a talented roster. Ohio State Buckeyes at plus 500 sneaking into the field after an absolutely embarrassing loss to Michigan at home. And I do think that this Ohio State team does have the talent to beat the Oregons and Texases of the world. But I do feel like it's going to come down to how this roster handles playoff football. This is their first time, really as a group in quite some time, that they've been to the playoff. And I do feel like that the moment might get a little bit big for them in certain moments, but they have the talent. When you look at this roster on both sides of the football, you're probably looking at the best wide receiving core in this entire field, with Ibuka, one of the most experienced wide receivers in college football, Jeremiah Smith, one of the best youngsters in college football at the position, Carnell Tate, another solid youngster, and Will Howard at the quarterback position, and Quinson Judkins and Travion Henderson, that 1-2 tandem in the backfield. You have the talent there. On defense, JT Tuimoloau, Cody Simon, Jack Sawyer. You have great players at each and every level. Caleb Downs, the Alabama transfer, really bolstering this defense. Really the best roster money can buy when you look at a college football team. But, like I said, if you beat Tennessee at home and have to face Oregon again, will the moment get too big for you? The main thing I've talked about with Will Howard is mistakes, and he's prone to make them in pivotal moments, as we've seen in those 2 losses. But I do think that Ohio State is one of the most likely teams to catch fire in this field as well, and I do think that if you want to stay in this 5-team realm in terms of how you bet, this could be the quote-unquote dark horse you could feel most comfortable betting on. just because you know they have the talent. It's just about cohering at the right time. And even on that tough side of the bracket, I do feel Ohio State might just be one of the teams you might not want to face in the semifinal and championship rounds. So that's why I feel like this is a team that's lurking in the background, on the outside looking in a little bit, that people might be doubting after that loss, that might catch fire at the right time. So look for Ohio State to be a dark horse here. Then, at number 3, this team might fall out of this top 5. This was written quite some time ago, so they might have already. But they are the most experienced team in this field. And I do feel that with Kirby Smart at the helm at the coaching position, I do feel you can't count this team out either way. The Georgia Bulldogs. I really think that even though you get the news that Carson Beck is missing the entirety of the CFP, this team still will have a fighter's chance to win it all. They are on the easier side of the bracket. They might have to face Penn State in what could be a physical rock fight. But at the end of the day, I feel like Kirby Smart is the difference maker here. He's someone who's seen it all, knows what it takes to win championships consistently, and has done it with a guy like Stetson Bennett, who a lot of people didn't think could do it, and yet above all odds got them to the promised land. So why can't Gunnar Stockton? And I know he's a little bit raw, hasn't seen much playing time this season, but he did just enough against Texas in the SEC championship game to truly prove that there might be something that Kirby Smart can build upon with him. They're going to have to change a lot of their game scripts to tailor to what he can do, but he still is a stellar athlete, and there's a reason why Georgia is still someone as, thank you for the tip, Meryl Shepard, I appreciate it. I do feel like there's a reason why Vegas is still so high on this team. I'm going to have to check and see if they're still in the top 5, because who knows, that news of Carson Beck might have thrown some bettors off and thus have shaken up the odds. But I still think that Georgia is sitting in a position at plus 480 at this current moment in time, where you don't want to face the experience they have. And even if Gunnar Stockton is just serviceable, not necessarily a superstar, high-level athlete, they can still get the job done. And I feel like this is a team that's sitting in prime position to get to that championship game on that side of the bracket. So look for Georgia to potentially be a surprise, potentially be a betting darling in terms of the experience and because they have perhaps the best coach in this field. Then at number 2, the number 1 team in the country, the number 1 team for quite some time for a reason, the Oregon Ducks at plus 360. And I feel this Oregon Ducks team could have been at the number 1 spot. I'm actually a little bit shocked to see who was at the number 1 spot, even though as a fan I'm not mad at it. And that kind of gives it away, but we'll get into that in a second. But the reason why I like Oregon here is that at plus 360, when you look at their strength of record, their strength of schedule, their undefeated record, despite the fact they got to that rocky start early in the season where they played close against FCS Idaho and fellow CFP team Boise State, I do feel like the Oregon Ducks are the perfect complementary football team. You have Dylan Gabriel, most experienced college football quarterback right now, one of the top players in all of college football history in terms of stats, one of the top passing yards leaders, potentially could be when this is all said and done. Then you have receivers like Tez Johnson, Texas A&M transfer, Evan Stewart, who are real field stretchers. You have Jordan James, an underrated running back in this field. Then you combine it with a defense. Jordan Birch, yes, he's been battling injuries, but when he's playing, a real menace up front. The best Uyunglele brother, Matayo Uyunglele, really seeing a sophomore surge, being one of the best players on that defensive unit. Combine it together, and you get a team that is going to be very tough to beat, both tactically and physically. And so that's why I feel like this team could make the case for number 1. But I do feel like the difference between them and this number 1 team is that there are so many storylines that could play into this number one team in terms of betting odds surge. And I feel like, even though I'm a fan and I don't want to be too biased, I can see where Vegas is coming from by having them as the number one team, despite the fact I was very surprised to see them there initially. And the number one team is the Texas Longhorns at plus 360. And I feel like the reason they're here is two things. The fact that you're having the discussion about Quinn Ewers and Arch Manning, that QB situation, and B, this elite defense on that side of the bracket, combined with the way Texas can play with Quinn Ewers. It's going to be very physical should Quinn Ewers be the guy that Steve Sarkisian relies upon in terms of heavy dosages of Trey Wisner and Jaden Blue and short to intermediate passes to guys like Gunnar Helm and Matthew Golden. And ultimately, I feel like if that wild card is played, if Steve Sarkisian says Arch can come in for a few packages, it changes the whole landscape of how you game plan, because you don't know when he's coming in, you don't know what he's coming in for, whether it's a zone read and he takes it to the house or they allow him to throw. That's what makes this Texas team so hard to gauge, and why people are still so high in it, despite the fact that right now they're entering it a little bit, uncertain. And so, even though a lot of people are thinking that this Texas team might not be as ready as we thought for this playoff round, they haven't really played anyone, no signature wins, this is a Texas team that still can beat you in a variety of ways and has the ultimate trump card here. So that's why I feel they're the number one team here, even though all four of these teams can make the case for being this number one betting favorite. But let me know what you think in the comments, because this could definitely change as we start to see these first round game results. But ultimately, I like this list. But coming up next, we transition to talk about Sunday Night Football, Bucs Cowboys, from a betting perspective, and then to conclude the show from a Stardom Cinema perspective. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about it.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of today's show, we take a transition into the world of Sunday Night Football, Bucs Cowboys here. And it's going to be an interesting game because of these two teams' styles of play. When we look at the Bucs, I do feel that the performance against the Los Angeles Chargers last week was very telling of what this Bucs team could potentially be once they get into the postseason, how dangerous that passing game is with Baker Mayfield playing his swashbuckling brand of football, combined with the elite consistency that is Mike Evans. But then I look at this Cowboys team, right? And the reason why they were my favorite starts of the week here at the defense position is because of their defensive turnaround, complemented with Cooper Rush's free nature in that offense. This team has become a tough out down the stretch, even though they're not necessarily playing for anything but pride. And I feel like, combined with this unexpected nature of what Tampa is week in, week out, I feel like this game's going to be a lot more entertaining than people think. And I feel like, even though the Bucs had that impressive win last week, the Cowboys can keep this close because of what they're able to do with a guy like Michael Parsons and how he creates space for other playmakers like DeMarcus Lawrence, Ozzie Odighizuwa in this defense. But yet, Vegas does still think Tampa Bay are the favorites here. They're the 4-point favorites here. The over-under is 48.5. They're projecting a kind of high-scoring game, not necessarily, one that really is going to be that exciting in terms of offenses putting up points consistently, but it's still pretty high for this level of game. Dallas plus 120, plus 170 rather, in terms of money lines, and Tampa Bay minus 200 in terms of money lines there. So as you can see, Vegas, from a betting standpoint, still on the side of Tampa here. But I still think that you can't discount the Cowboys and what they're able to do. Because when I think about this particular matchup and where both of these teams are this season, Tampa Bay could, for all intents and purposes, have been in the Cowboys' position, and the Cowboys, for all intents and purposes, could have been in Tampa Bay's position as a feisty team that you don't want to play in the playoffs. And Tampa Bay could have been a team similarly as feisty, but outside of the playoff picture trying to play spoiler. And so that's what makes this game, from a betting perspective, so hard to think about. I still think when you look at these teams on paper, right, the Bucs still have a lot more talent, even despite the fact that Chris Godwin isn't amongst his receiving core right now. I still think they've done a good job with the talent as well. Liam Cohen's underrated style of play really brings out the best in guys that might have been a little bit unheralded at certain times this season. Guys like Jalen McMillan, guys like Cade Otton, guys like Sean Tucker, Bucky Irving in the backfield. And so that's what makes this team so multifaceted and thus so dangerous to go up against. And that's why I feel like I would lean a little bit more towards Tampa Bay in this setting. Also because of the factor that Baker Mayfield, when he's playing like he played last week, is someone who can't be ignored. I know a lot of people discount his style of play as too freewheeling. Some people describe it as a little bit too reckless. But ultimately, in this offense, it works perfectly, combined with the trust Liam Cohen has in him and the trust Baker is developing with these new weapons. And so that's why it hasn't really lost a step, despite the fact, that glaring hole Chris Godwin leaves behind might come back to bite them. And then the Cowboys side of things, I just can't get past the fact that, despite the fact that this defense has turned around, despite the fact the offense looks a little bit more comfortable under Cooper Rush's leadership here, I do feel that this Cowboys team still has a little bit of a disconnect between itself and the organization. What I mean by that is this organization seeps too much into the mindset of this football team, has too much influence over the mindset of this football team in certain ways that kind of distracts it from truly performing to its level of standards, which is a feisty football team. Maybe not a feisty football team from a Tampa Bay standpoint, but still a feisty football team nevertheless. And so, when I look at this game, I want to say that Tampa Bay wins this one comfortably, just because of the things I described. But I have to give the Cowboys credit here, because despite all the turmoil, externally and internally, they still have put out a product that has improved steadily, knows what it has, and is prepared for the long-term future of this team. And even though a large part of that kind of lost its luster when Dak went down because of the fact this team is now in many ways intrinsically linked to that contract, I still do think that we're getting glimpses of what the best of this Cowboys team can be. And so that's why when I look at this game and how these two teams set up, the Cowboys can come in this a little bit more unafraid than the Bucs feel. And so I feel like when I describe these two teams, there's too many similarities to say that Tampa Bay will cover the spread. With that being said, I do feel like Tampa Bay is one of those teams capable of pulling away from a team like the Cowboys. When I look at the Cowboys these past couple of weeks, and look at the improvements they made on third down defense, on limiting explosive plays, there are little lapses. And it's not necessarily like these lapses are completely on the defense or completely on one side of the football. It's just lapses where you kind of feel like they're disconnecting in certain crucial moments of the game. And that's why I feel like Tampa Bay, playing as hot as they are, could take advantage of that. But I still think, say, around the late fourth quarter, this could be a one-score game where the Cowboys control their own fate in it. And it's going to come down to, those critical moments. Because I feel like Tampa Bay's execution of those critical moments goes unsaid. Yes, it's funny to say that when they have 2 losses to their division rival in overtime moments and moments of crucial importance, but they have had impressive drives, like the one against the Panthers a couple weeks ago. And, even to get the game against the Chiefs to overtime was very impressive. So, I do feel like this Bucs team has a little bit more decisiveness in those moments, a little bit more urgency in those moments. And I want to see if the Cowboys will be able to match that urgency a little bit more. Because when all is said and done, I feel like in the matchup of these two teams, one team completely out of the race but still playing spoiler, one team deep in the thick of the race playing very hot, I feel like those two conflicts are going to complement each other to the point where it's going to come down to final decisions in the final moments of the game. And I feel like what with the Bucs' multiplicity on offense, their different ways to kill a game off, whether it be through the running game, whether it be through Baker Mayfield relying on these lesser weapons, I feel like the Bucs just have a little bit more. Whereas the Cowboys, kind of shoot themselves in the foot a little bit too much. Sometimes, luck goes their way, much like they did against the Commanders. And so, I feel like luck, though, is not necessarily going to always happen when you're a team like the Cowboys. And I've seen it all season long, where they just can't be bothered in certain moments of the game, play pretty well, but ultimately let it slip. And then the Bucs, with all these games that they played really closely, have that late game experience. And so that's why I'm looking at this game. I'm going to talk about the importance of certain players from a fantasy perspective in our last segment here. But I do feel like this Bucs team won't matter what people think about it from a fantasy standpoint, because they know that production can come from the unlikeliest of weapons. I feel like when I talk about the fantasy, it's going to be weird to say certain players might have to be avoided. But ultimately, I feel like you can interpret this game any way you want because of what these two teams can bring to the table. And then, for my final prediction here, I'm going to have to say the Cowboys cover. And I don't necessarily feel like that's a statement that will favor me by this game's end. But I do feel like the Cowboys will just lose it in a moment where the Bucs, being the hotter, feistier team, just want it more. And I do feel like, this Bucs team might keep this Cowboys team around longer than you would think, because I haven't talked about this defense, and this defense is pretty middling by certain standards. They have the weapons on that defensive side of the football, but I don't necessarily know if they're going to be limiting the Cowboys on what they can do in certain situations. So that's why I feel that the Cowboys can stick around in this one for longer than people think, but ultimately lose their heads in late game situations, and ultimately the Bucs will take advantage of that. And then, before we go into break, I want to address a comment from Tap to Learn. Cowboys will never max out with Dak at the helm. I'm not necessarily certain they will either, but I do feel like, from what I've seen this season, they now have a little more optimism and freedom than it looked like they had early in the season. And yes, while you make the point, and this next comment here about not staying on the field, I do feel like, they have contingency plans in place where they feel comfortable they can get the best out of this team. It might not be the prettiest of plans, but still a plan in which the Cowboys can still play a little bit more freely than they would before the contract, so to speak. Because now the contract is over, they can take a deep exhale. And that's why I feel like, as he also suggests, they could poke the Eagles in the eyes in the next couple of weeks. And I hope they poke the Commanders' eyes as well, depending on Seattle's situation. But ultimately, that's where the Cowboys are right now. They're a kind of enigmatic team heading down the stretch who potentially be a surprise team, but potentially lose their luster and lose their heads in certain moments. But let me know what you think about this game a little bit more as we talk about it from a fantasy perspective in our last segment coming up after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back into the final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our final segment of the day, we're talking a little bit more about the Sunday Night Football game from a fantasy standpoint, because there could be a lot at stake in this one, a lot of talent between these two teams from that perspective. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off the Bucs side of things, we already talked about this multifaceted offense. Despite the fact that they're down one of their top receivers, a lot of unsung heroes have stepped up for them in the past 2 weeks, and that has really led to this team climbing the standings in the NFC South. And I feel like, I feel like a lot of the Bucs' success does still predicate itself on the connection between Baker and Mike Evans, but I do feel like these two players who I did say you might want to avoid this week just because A, it's a high-stakes match, and B, I don't necessarily know if some of their success throughout the year will continue. I do feel like they still can provide for this team in this setting. So without further ado, let's jump right into the Bucs side of things from a fantasy standpoint. And I feel like the two players are obvious in terms of who you might want to start in Baker and Mike Evans. Let's start off with Baker. He's my personal fantasy football QB, so I have a lot of love for him and what he's been able to do this season in a fantasy setting. And I feel like these past couple of weeks have shown the best of a confident Baker Mayfield in the NFL. Because when he's playing this confident brand of football, he's really bringing out the best in everyone. And that's really led to a surge in these underrated stars here in the Bucs really shining. And so that's why I feel he's a no-brainer for a lot of players in a fantasy setting for these later stages. And then from a Mike Evans standpoint, what can we say about him? Because he has been one of the most consistent fantasy performers, as Tata Lerner says, is Bucky healthy. I'm not necessarily certain. I do know that he's been battling an injury for quite some time. And we'll talk about if he's in this game, how important he will be. But ultimately, that does kind of change things in my mind a little bit. Talking about this team from a fantasy standpoint, should he not play? But I do think from this perspective, if he does play, he still will have a lot more importance than people think. Even though getting into the sits here for the Bucs, I do think he's not going to have as huge an impact as fantasy owners would like. And getting into the sits is kind of hard to pick two players or several players who would have to sit or avoid in a fantasy perspective from the Bucs, just because this is a team that does rely a lot on their two weapon stars. But ultimately, these guys, I don't necessarily know if you would place too much trust in from a fantasy playoff perspective just yet. They're two young guys who I do believe have bright futures in this offense and have proven to be underrated hidden gems in a fantasy perspective this season. But ultimately, in this moment, I do feel like these two players might lose a little bit of their luster just because of the high-stakes nature of fantasy football playoffs. Jalen McMillan, let's start with him. Very underrated tight end. I love this guy, especially in third and short situations, in the middle areas of the field. Definitely in crossing routes as well, especially in the red zone. I feel like he can have a huge impact on this game. They're definitely going to go to him a lot in short yard situations, where they feel like they can get him open and scheme him open. As Tattler also mentioned that Bucky is not on the injury report, much like what I thought. I do believe that he still does have a minor injury, but he should be good to go for this one. But talking about McMillan a little bit before we get into Bucky here, I do feel like this is an awkward sit just because he technically is the wide receiver 2 in this offense from the way he's been playing. But in this moment, I feel like it's going to come down to your last-minute decision-making and analysis of certain players and their matchups. And even though this could potentially be an interesting matchup here for McMillan, where he could be receiving a lot more targets than expected should the Cowboys, much like I think they will, key in on Mike Evans, I do feel like a lot of people might want a little bit more depth at the wide receiver position because they know the wide receiver position could be a lot more pivotal than other positions in this setting. And so that's why I feel like Jalen McMillan might not even be a flex option to most people and might be someone you might want to avoid overall, at least in this setting, because he does still add value, but I'm not necessarily certain you would place that much value on him in this situation. And then Bucky Irving, a lot of people love him. I still love him as a fantasy running back, and I hope he continues to improve. But in this setting, against this Cowboys run defense especially, I feel like Bucky is definitely not someone who you rely upon in a very weak running back position because you're going to have to make a lot more tight decisions at that position than any other because you have very few elite options and the guys in the middle of the pack you're really going to have to look at a lot more closely. And Bucky's going to be right in the middle of it all because he truly personifies someone who has been week in, week out, consistent, but does have some flaws where he might not show up in certain games. And I'm just looking at this matchup as well as the stakes involved with it and thinking that Bucky, even with this injury and the concern surrounding that, might not get that much love from a fantasy standpoint. So that's why I feel like you might want to avoid him in this setting. And then on the Cowboys side of things, because the Cowboys are still a team, like it or not, that I still feel like adds a lot of fantasy value here. Despite the fact that, as would you start Myers or Ford, says Tyler Sperry, O'Connell is healthy. I feel like, if you're talking about Jerome Ford here, he's not necessarily someone I would rely upon in these moments, especially considering there seems to be a lot of uncertainty around the Browns as a whole offensively. But even without O'Connell, Myers could be a pivotal point for this Raiders offense. Definitely not the biggest weapon for Las Vegas, but ultimately someone who I like a lot, kind of comparable to a Jalen McMillan in terms of how reliable he can be in certain situations. So even if O'Connell does play, look for whoever is at the quarterback position for the Raiders to really key in on utilizing him in those short yardage situations, in those tight situations, maybe in the red zone, to the best of their abilities. Much like I suspect Jalen McMillan will try and be used in this matchup here. But thank you for your comments throughout the show, Tyler Sperry. I wish you the best of luck in your playoff matchups. Ask me for any more advice on the stretch if you so choose. But getting into the Cowboys here really quickly, I do feel like the two offensive weapons that you might want to look at as starters here and viable fantasy assets, CeeDee Lamb and Rico Dowdle. I feel like Rico Dowdle has kind of been a surprise these past couple of weeks in terms of the consistency he's added in the run game for Dallas here. I feel like they're going to utilize him a lot more down the stretch here to try and play a little bit more controlled in certain situations. So I feel like in the crucial moments that I feel like the Cowboys have lost these past couple of weeks, look for them to try and give Rico Dowdle a lot more touches in those moments. And then CeeDee Lamb, perhaps one of the most consistent fantasy wide receivers. And I feel like CeeDee Lamb, despite the fact Dak Prescott's not throwing him the football, despite the fact all these contract talks and turmoil and fallout from that might continue into this next season should the Cowboys look much like they did to start the season in the starting half of the 2025 season, then that's where maybe concerns will stem in. But he's still someone who provides so much consistency, so much production at the wide receiver position that it's tough to deny him, even with the inconsistencies we've seen almost all season long from this Cowboys offense. And I just feel like Cooper Rush is starting to really develop a nice rapport with him to the point where we can rely on him a little bit more in that setting. In terms of who to sit, and I know it's kind of tough because this Cowboys offense feels so clear-cut in intent in terms of trying to develop that balance with the run game combined with the explosiveness of a guy like CeeDee Lamb. But ultimately, I kind of feel like the more and more we see out of this Cowboys offense, the more obvious it becomes that certain players might just fall to the wayside here. And so, guys like Jake Ferguson and Cooper Rush, who were not necessarily in Jake Ferguson's regard, but definitely in Cooper Rush's, were seen as mid-season fantasy darlings, whereas a guy like Jake Ferguson really has had a very underwhelming fantasy season at the tight end position. And I feel like the reason why Cooper Rush can kind of not take the blame, so to speak, here in terms of who to sit and kind of could potentially be a fantasy sleeper and be justified in certain leagues. A guy like Jake Ferguson has no excuses because he was seen, in my opinion, as one of the most highly coveted tight ends before the season even started. But really, whether it was Dak Prescott or Cooper Rush at the quarterback position, didn't necessarily develop on last year. And I really feel kind of sorry for him because he was seen as this guy who was going to be a physical red zone threat, going to get the lion's share of targets down there, and ultimately didn't live up to that promise. And I know that the Cowboys had a lot of rotation in this offense that ultimately led to a little bit of stagnation for certain players who could have seen a lot more offensive production this season. But ultimately, Jake Ferguson is one of those players, and thus I don't necessarily see much value in starting him in these high-stakes moments, despite the fact, potentially, of your wide receiver or your tight end room being deep. And Cooper Rush, I certainly feel like, in deeper leagues maybe, but not in these critical moments. But let me know what you think from my fantasy advice in the comments. But that will just about do it for today's show. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back Monday the 30th. Enjoy the holidays. In the meantime, for more GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast talk, but remember, as always, like, follow, subscribe. Consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features more in the new year. But other than that, I'm out for the time being. Thank you for an incredible year here at the show.